We spoke to George Soros. He says, look, the next year will be disastrous. Now, this is part because he's talking his book, and it's very different, Donald Trump, his ideas. Lay out for us what President Trump means for America in the next 12 months.
Very hard to know. I think the risks are rather greater than many people suppose. Biggest risks actually are probably not in the economics area. Biggest risks are geopolitical, with huge provocation vis-a-vis China, with a kind of unprecedented equating of our NATO allies with the Soviet Union, with challenges to something that's been a centerpiece of American foreign policy, support for European unity, and with unpredictability vis-a-vis the volatile Middle East. So I think there are big risks in that area. I think there are big risks in terms of the approach that's being taken to American democracy, the extent to which our new president is engaged in demonization of particular groups like Muslims within the United States, the extent to which he has called into question the traditional rule of law with ad hoc approaches to making demands of individual companies. All of that is, I think, a cause for concern, and certainly in the economic area, it's very hard to know. My judgment has been that the current wave of optimism is something of a sugar high, and that before long, the consequences of the strong dollar, of substantial policy uncertainty, will be felt in markets and economic growth.
Larry,
but that's a judgment. I
keep on being told he's a businessman. A businessman does not want a trade war unless it's a negotiating tactic.
I've been very troubled by the attitude of business people from the United States here in Davos. People who 2-3 months ago were saying he was a man they would never do business with are today hailing him as a great economic statesman.
I would continue, Professor, but he's 100% right. It has been stunning, the turnaround of American executives.
The people who were terribly afraid of what this would mean for America's place in the world are now hailing those who surround
hail
those around Donald Trump as great geniuses. You know, every time you look at some kind of moral disaster, whether it's bullying on a playground, whether it's what happened at Enron, whether it's Europe in the 1930s, the key to it is not that there were people who did wrong, that there will always be. The key to it is that good people went along and didn't get in the way. And I see a very disturbing tendency to enable whatever the instinct of this new administration is. And I think that's something that over time the business community may very much come to regret.
Larry, in the generous time that we have with you this morning, this historic day for America and frankly for the global economic system, I want to take you back to the work of one of your uncles, not Ken Arrow, but Paul Samuelson, who wrote a textbook, Samuelson 1948. It was iconic. It changed the world, I would suggest. If you handed Samuelson 48 to the President of the United States tomorrow, which chapter should he read? What does Mr. Trump need to bone up on from Paul Samuelson?
I don't think Mr. Trump's problems are what he doesn't know. It's the things he knows that aren't so.
Give us one idea there that
it's the mistakes.
When you talk about economic,
it's the conviction that mercantilist protectionist economics somehow drives prosperity, which I think almost all economists would agree is a confusion. It's the belief that somehow you can base a capitalist system not on rules but on individual ad hoc deals. I think that's another substantial
Larry, what will
mistake.
be the ramifications of a neo-mercantilism, this narrowness that we hear from Secretary Ross, Wilbur Ross, we hear it from Peter Navarro, we hear it from the president. What will be the outcome for the diehard Trump supporters that were at the Lincoln Memorial yesterday and will be at Capitol Hill at 12 noon?
Ultimately, their incomes are going to be lower because they're going to be paying much higher prices for the products they buy. Ultimately, they're going to be poorer because of a cycle of protection that's going to weaken the global economy. And ultimately, the consequences of all of this, once it works through exchange rates, is going to be exactly the opposite of what's hoped. I mean, think about Mexico. Yes, he had a conversation with the CEO, and a few hundred jobs perhaps got preserved for some interval. At the same time, the Mexican peso is down 15%, and that means that for anyone considering locating business in Mexico or Ohio, Mexico now has a new 15% cost advantage.
But so what are the
I think
checks
it's
and
all going to be
balances?
very counterproductive.
Larry, what are the checks and balances? At the end of the day, will it be Congress, or will it actually be the Constitution, or will it simply be the markets and the high dollar?
I hope it will be some combination of all three. I would have hoped that the business community would have been an important, and the sentiment of the business community, and the business community is hugely respected in America and has substantial influence in Congress. And I would have hoped that the business community would have been a substantial moderating influence. But after seeing Davos, I now have much more doubt about that.
But the problem is that it's very easy for them to see, but they're the elite, they're out of touch, right? So how
The business community may or may not be in touch, but I don't think that's the key to this. I think the key is whether they take a medium-term view where their success and America's success go very much together, or whether they're so mesmerized by the possibility of a tax break in the next
Larry, they're
few
talking
months
their
that
book.
they lose sight
But
of
isn't the
their
tweet
longer-term
significant?
interest.
I mean, the Trump tweet, right? The one that for Toyota meant they lost in 5 minutes $1.3 billion of market cap. Isn't that why CEOs here are afraid to speak up?
I think that is an important. That's part of it. I think part of it is that a rhetoric coming out of the administration that's more celebratory of business is something they like. I think they had some legitimate concerns about excessive regulation, and in the previous administration. I mean, I always have said for years now that confidence is the cheapest form of stimulus, and I think that in retrospect, more probably could have been done to promote business confidence. So it's a complex thing, but I don't think any of that justifies the kind of enabling of what I think are quite dangerous policies, practices, and rhetoric that I think the business community has been engaged in.
I want to go back to your iconic cover with Mr. Rubin and Mr. Greenspan on Time Magazine. I want to go back to the common ground between Summers economics and, say, the economics of John Taylor at Stanford University, which is dollar dynamics are smooth and in control, and the elites have control of those dynamics, and then they unravel. You mentioned Mexican peso, 21.95, printing 22 to 1 against the U.S. dollar. Are we near a point where those exchanges is the litmus paper of the system suggest we could unravel, or does this president have room to move to learn on the job?
You never really know. Things are stable until they're not, and that's why seeking to encourage volatility. That's why in prudent administrations, the custom has evolved that presidents don't make casual commentary on currency values. So I think there are risks. I don't know what the imminence of those risks is, and I think anybody who tries to say that there's going to be doom and gloom tomorrow, for sure, is making a mistake. I'd be the first to recognize that there's substantial uncertainties, but I certainly also think we are taking risks, and our new president is being enabled in that risk-taking by people who one looks to normally to be appropriately cautionary.
It was Steve Mnuchin in his hearing yesterday, right, in saying, well, we should actually call China a currency manipulator if that's what they do. Or do we need to be a lot more subtle in our dealings with China?
I think if China manipulates its currency, we would be right to call that out. I think any sentient observer of what's going on now will recognize that China is spending huge quantities of reserves and engaging in very substantial controls with the objective of preventing its currency from falling. And so the suggestion that somehow China is driving its currency down for competitive advantage was a sensible thought and a reasonable analysis years ago, but I think makes almost no sense in the context of this moment.
Help us with the emotion you created with Bloomberg surveillance 10 days ago or more of speaking of economic creationism. That's a loaded phrase. Define that further and define how the people around Mr. Trump can help him towards a more traditional economic analysis.
Well, I used the term to refer to a paper that was written by two apparently central figures in the Trump administration, Wilbur Ross and Peter Navarro, that would be the kind of example one would give on a freshman exam of an economic analysis for them
Taking them back to David Ricardo.
And dissect and correct in its suggestion that anything that reduced imports necessarily increased the GDP, which is frankly a ludicrous suggestion, in the same way that climate denial violates science and in the same way that creationist science violates what we know about biology. This is an equal level of fallacy. Whether that's what will ultimately drive policy in this administration remains to be seen.
What are the chances of a trade war between the U.S. and China, given what we've just talked about? And
I think
the
chance of a cycle of protection and retaliatory protection has to be as high as it's been any time in the last 25 years, and there certainly are real risks.
But this is what, a 50-50 or a 70-30?
I'm not going to handicap it beyond saying that it's a good deal higher than it needs to be. And it seems to me that some stage has been set for imprudent action. What the new administration will actually do, I very much hope that they will decouple the Taiwan issue and the trade issue, because I think that linkage is unsound. And I hope they will pursue legitimate U.S. commercial interests in China, but do so in a prudent way.
Very quickly, this is so important. Secretary Kissinger will speak today to this Davos audience. He wrote the book World Order. Is this thus a new world order with President Trump?
I think it remains to be seen. As I say, what will happen. I am concerned that the United States, it may or may not have been hubristic, as was common in the Clinton administration, to refer to the United States as the indispensable nation. But I think almost anybody would agree that the United States, given its economic, its military, its cultural strength, has done a lot to underpin a global system, and a global system that, for all the problems, has done very, very well over the 70 years since the Second World War. And I think we're seeing more risk of the United States abandoning that role than certainly any time I've ever observed.